Let me know, Melissa, and I'll hit record. Okay, good.
All right.
Actually, Melissa, can you hit record, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for joining us and your patience, everyone. My name is Melissa Horn. I am an aide to Councilwoman Sandoval in Northwest Denver. This is our Ask a Planner series where we invite departments and agencies to come and speak directly on topics that are relevant in Northwest Denver and answer some questions from constituents. So today we're fortunate enough to have Scott Burton and Juan Garza with us from the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure to discuss the Highland Curbside Access Plan. Scott will run through his presentation and then we'll move through to a question and answer portion. So please feel free to put your questions in the Zoom chat and I will relay those to him. As a reminder, this is being recorded and live streamed to Facebook. We will also post the recording to the Councilwoman's YouTube channel to be viewed by people that were not able to attend. So I appreciate you coming, Scott, and I'll turn this over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Melissa, Gina, and Councilwoman Sandoval for having us. We did an event similar to this when we were prior to the implementation of our Berkeley Park, Tennyson Street curbside access plan a couple of years ago. It worked well. So I look forward to the questions and the discussion. So as Melissa mentioned, I'm Scott Burton. I'm a principal transportation planner with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, more specifically with the Transportation Operations Group and Curbside and Parking. And we are here today to talk about the Highland Curbside Access Plan. So we're in the outreach phase and wanted to provide you all with a quick overview of the plan, recommendations, a little bit about the Curbside Access Plan process, and then focus on questions and discussion. We should have at least 35 to 40 minutes left for that. So I'll try to go through these slides pretty quickly. And with that, I will share my screen. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. But it looked like I could a second ago.
See if you're able to get that shared now. I made you a co-host.
Yep. Yep, all set, it looks like.
Perfect.
Yep, perfect. Thank you, Melissa. Yep, there we are. Move this over here. All right, perfect. Thank you. So in terms of the agenda, as I mentioned, we will talk at a high level about the Curbside Access Plan process, discuss the Highland Curbside Access Plan data that was collected in advance of us identifying goals and recommendations. We will discuss some of the challenges, user groups, and generators, talk about goals, recommendations, and then since there aren't a lot of permitted areas, residential parking permitted areas within our study area, Juan Garza will provide an overview of the application process. So with that, we can go ahead and get started. So quickly, what are curbside access plans? So they're basically neighborhood or area-based comprehensive curbside and parking plans that result in the implementation typically of hundreds of parking signs and restrictions. This concept of the curbside access plan was introduced in our strategic parking plan about 10 years ago. The process has remained the same, but the name has changed at least a few times in the last 10 to 15 years. It was formerly referred to as our area management plan program. Then it was our curbside area management plan program, and now it's our curbside access plan program. So the name has evolved, but the process is the same. Typically, plans are implemented within 12 to 18 months, and the primary focus is that these plans are designed to address an area's changing conditions and the curbside and parking needs of various users. And they're designed to address current levels of activity, redevelopment, rezonings, and the evolving parking patterns. They're very customized and collaborative. So there are certainly similarities between the recommendations in this plan and the recommendations associated with other curbside access plans. But at the same time, they are pretty different. You'll see that here shortly, but they're very collaborative in the sense that we really rely on a stakeholder working group to help us identify users and challenges and generators and goals and recommendations. We rely on them to help us draft a plan that we then share with the community more broadly. And that's what we've done for the last month and then again today. So some of the expected outcomes is that we really want to focus on maximizing curbside resources. And that's a term that you'll probably hear again in this presentation. That's really a focus of ours, that giving all the competing uses for the curbside. We know that we have, traditional parking and loading, we have bike lanes and transit lanes, and there's a variety of different demands. And so we want to make sure that given that curbside resources are relatively scarce, that we're maximizing them, that we're using them efficiently. Another expected outcome would be addressing current levels of activity and then addressing the parking and curbside needs of various users. We want to make sure that these recommendations and these strategies correspond to changing land uses, increasing densities, ongoing and completed redevelopments, with the idea that we want to provide a predictable experience from a curbside perspective for all users, so that the parking restrictions in the area are kind of uniform and people know where to find, whether it be time limited parking or paid parking, that it's predictable. And if you're loading, you know where to expect that loading zone to be located. We also want to support multimodal transportation infrastructure. By that, we mean we want to support the installation of city bike corrals and scooter corrals. And then we want to balance curbside strategies. We want to make sure that we're providing options for all users, and we do that by providing a balance of different restrictions. In terms of the timeline for this effort, step one is to initiate the process. That usually includes collecting parking occupancy data that I'll show shortly, assembling our stakeholder working group. Obviously, we want to make sure that we have the support of the council district that we're working in. A lot of this work was conducted a few years ago. We were actually preparing to kick off this Highland Curbside Access Plan effort just before COVID, but that changed things, and we came and kicked off in April of 2022. So that first meeting was held about a year ago. I think it was towards the end of April 2022. And that conversation focused on identifying parking challenges, generators, and user groups. We then met towards the end of May 2022 to establish goals. We then realized that the parking data that we had access to was from 2018, and it didn't really reflect, the current parking patterns in the neighborhood. So we put the process on pause for a few months and had a consultant collect parking occupancy data that I can show you here in a second. That information is really used to inform our recommendations. And so we came back after that data was collected, we came back in October and identified goals and recommendations. And in case you're curious, in terms of where we worked in the past, we've recently installed a curbside access plan in the Cole neighborhood. So that is the east portion of what people refer to as Rhino, so kind of near 38th and Blake, east of Downing. We installed one a couple years ago along Tennyson Street in Berkeley Park. We're currently working on Upper Lammer. That's what we're calling that plan. That is really our Rhino curbside access plan. We have one in the Highland neighborhood, and we're also working on one in Cherry Creek. So that's Cherry Creek North, East, and that includes the commercial portion of that area as well. And then we have one plan for Jefferson Park that we will kick off at some point this summer, and then one along the Colfax corridor, primarily focusing on Colfax between, call it Lincoln and Colorado. So here's some of the curbside data that was collected. This was collected June of last year. So you all are probably pretty familiar with the neighborhood and are aware that there aren't a lot of parking restrictions in the neighborhood currently. Most of what exists today is 2-hour parking, as you can see here. And most of that 2-hour parking is 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And there are some 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Parking restrictions that exist, I think along Tejon here, perhaps 32nd Avenue, and then again here on 29th. And so when I talk about consistency and predictability, that's one of the things that we get at, is the need to not have a variety of different restrictions all the time, but try to keep it uniform when it makes sense, when it supports nearby activities. So there aren't a lot of parking restrictions. We know that. We then collected 5 a.m. parking occupancy data. This was collected in June of last year. And we really rely on 5 a.m. parking occupancy data to let us know what the resident demand is for parking in the area, with the idea that if you're parked at 5 a.m., you likely live there. So this helps us just document what the resident demand is for on-street parking. So anything green is the occupancy is less than 65%. If it's orange, it's between 65 and 75% occupied. And then red is 75% or more. occupied. So then transitioning between 5 a.m. and noon, you can see that the area does become more busy. At this point, you probably have employee, patron, and resident demand. So obviously the occupancy would increase as a result. And this is probably my favorite one, is when you transition between noon, which looks more occupied than 5 a.m. And then there's noon, and then here's what 7 p.m. looks like. And to those that live in the neighborhood, you won't find this surprising. This was collected on Friday evening, first or second week in June. And it's, incredibly occupied, a lot of parking demand that can clearly be seen here. So at noon, it's, primarily concentrated 32nd Avenue down to Central Street. But by 7 p.m., consistent occupancy all the way up to 35th and then even between 35th and 38th Avenue. So we really rely on this data here to help us with the draft recommendations that I'll share here in the coming slides. So before we identify recommendations, I mentioned that we focus on discussing challenges and users. So some of the challenges that were identified in those conversations with our stakeholder working group are infrequent parking space availability, that because there aren't a lot of time limits, there isn't a lot of parking turnover. As a result, it can be hard for patrons to find spaces and for residents to find parking as well. That there is significant employee parking demand, resident access as an issue, as I mentioned. There's also inadequate parking enforcement and insufficient site distance. And what we mean by that is there are oftentimes, because there aren't a lot of parking restrictions, there aren't a lot of, no parking signs at the intersection to reinforce that people legally can't park within 20 feet of a crosswalk or an intersection. And so we want to make sure that through this effort, we're improving site distance at intersections and alleyways. And another challenge identified was just scooter parking, that it's a little disorganized, this causing sidewalk clutter, impacting ADA access, and those types of things. And then you have commuter parking. So not only do you have employees that are parking in the neighborhood, but you might have commuters that are parking in the neighborhood and then walking towards downtown and Union Station. And then you just have inconsistent parking time limits that have been implemented kind of piecemeal over the years. In terms of users, I'll run through this list quickly. We have construction workers, local employees, patrons, their guests, commuters. You have a lot of loading demand. So FedEx, Amazon, UPS, Cisco. And then you have rideshare in the evening, Uber and Lyft. And then you have bikes, peds, and scooters. And obviously, we're all familiar with the fact that this is a popular area, right? It's popular not only within the Highland neighborhood, but within Denver and the metro area. There's a lot of destinations here that people seek out. And our 7 p.m. occupancy clearly shows that it's an area in high demand, especially in the summer months. So jumping down to goals. So some of the goals that were identified include parking space availability, the need to increase turnover, to provide more loading opportunities, to provide some orderly bicycle and scooter parking to try to organize the parking of those vehicles, improved site distance and accessible parking. So installing some ADA parking spaces. And then again, comprehensive strategies instead of the piecemeal approach. So you'll see that the goals correspond pretty closely with recommendations. So one way we would increase parking space availability would be through paid parking. We can get into that here in a second. And then traditional time limits that are non-paid. These are primarily in the residential areas. The implementation of more loading zones, some bicycle and scooter corrals that we have planned, and then recommendation that we really look at site distance at those intersections to create a safer environment for all modes. And since paid parking does not exist in the neighborhood currently, I just wanted to highlight a few of the advantages of a paid parking environment. So it does increase typically time limit compliance. The rationale behind that one is that if you're going to pay for parking, you don't want to have a citation on top of that. So you're more likely to stay for 2 or 3 hours. It enhances the customer experience with the idea that paid parking, the paid parking is implemented in such a way that we want to ensure that there are a couple spaces available on each block. So the people that want to frequent the area, that they want to pay for those convenient high demand spaces in the core of the commercial portion of the neighborhood, don't have to circle around looking for parking spaces, that the price is set so that there are a couple spaces available on each block. So that promotes parking space availability. This performance-based approach that's data-driven is also commonly referred to as dynamic pricing or variable pricing. So yeah, it reduces vehicle miles traveled, circling, and emissions. Not as many vehicles, circling the block looking for parking is very common in the neighborhood currently. And there's not a lot of off-street parking in the neighborhood, as you know, but if paid parking is present in an area with a lot of off-street parking, if users are desiring to stay for, more than 2 or 3 hours, users desiring that longer term parking resource, then they might park off-street. And so it also encourages non-vehicle travel with the idea that if it is paid, it is time limited, and you live nearby, you might be more likely to walk or ride your bike. You might Uber and Lyft into the area, and then efficient enforcement. So if the city is going to spend money and resources installing paid parking in the neighborhood and implementing pay by phone, we want to make sure that the strategies that are implemented are working well and are enforced. And so there's a commitment when paid parking is installed, or just when a curbside access plan is installed in general, that there be consistent enforcement to make sure those strategies are working well. With that, I'll highlight a few of the recommendations. So this graphic, for the most part, is identical to what many residents received, or all residents within the study area should have received late March, early April. And I'll walk through some of these recommendations. So when I talk about paid parking, internally, we talk about the triangle, because it looks like a triangle here, 32nd Avenue, Tejon to Central Street. We're proposing to introduce 2-hour paid parking from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. So this would not be done through single space parking meters that are common downtown and in other areas. This would be done through the implementation of roughly 1 pay station per block, and then really relying on pay by mobile, pay by phone also, so that users can use the app or pay at the kiosk, but it wouldn't be implemented using traditional single space meters. And that would be done here again, 32nd to Tejon, Central Street, in the commercial core of the neighborhood. And then in addition to that, we'd be looking to introduce 3-hour non-paid time limits west of Tejon and north of 32nd Avenue. These are the green lines on the graphic that you see here. These would also be effective between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. And then residents living in the area would be eligible for residential parking permits, so that they would be exempt from those time limits. And then in addition, we have this blue shaded area that you can see here. This is our Highland area permit. So the idea behind that is, today, most permitted areas within the city, if you live on, let's say, the 3200 block of Tejon, you can only park on your block. So if your block is full, your permit is not valid on adjacent streets. So with an area permit, residents are allowed to park anywhere within this blue shaded area. So just increases the number of blocks where the permit is valid. It also makes it easier for right-of-way enforcement from an enforcement standpoint. So we'd be looking to implement time limits on the streets and on some of the avenues. So the rationale behind leaving 35th Avenue unrestricted, for example, and then portions of 31st, 30th, and 29th is to provide unrestricted options for employees and those wanting to park for longer than 3 hours. And so the thought is that you have paid parking in the core, and as you work out of there, you would have time limits, 3-hour time limits, and then unrestricted parking on the avenues for those longer term parking needs. And then we'd also be looking to introduce 4 bike parking corrals. These would be placed in no parking areas at the intersection, so they wouldn't necessarily result in the reduction of a vehicle parking space. Right now, we're proposing to install these at 36th and Tejon, at 32nd and Tejon, 1 at 37th and Navajo, and 1 at 34th and Navajo as well. We've talked about a couple locations within the core. There is quite a bit of bike parking there currently, and there's a few lift corrals. And so this graphic will be updated. So by the time we mail our second letter to all impacted addresses, this graphic will be updated not only to reflect all the modifications made based on feedback received, but also the locations of some of the lime corrals that have installed, lime and lift corrals that have installed recently. And they're also looking to install 2 ADA spaces on Boulder Street. And let's see, with that, I will turn it over to Juan Garza. He's going to walk through our residential parking permit application process. Thanks, Juan.
Thanks, Scott. To apply for a residential parking permit, you want to visit our city website at denvergov.org/parking. From there, you can navigate to our residential parking permit page and you can select Apply Now. And that'll direct you to our vendor website, and that vendor is Passport. You'll need to register for a new account as a new user, and that just really involves creating an email and a password that you can use to log into your permit account. And here you can apply for permits. And once you have permits, you'll be able to view and manage them. You could cancel them. You could request, hey, I got a new car. And you can also see any pending applications you have for permits. Next slide, please. So you'll need 3 documents to apply. One is your driver's license. The other is your vehicle registration if you're trying to get a permit for a specific vehicle. And then lastly, proof of residence document, which can be a utility bill like gas, electric, water, TV or internet bill, a current auto, renters or home insurance, or a fully executed lease. We do not accept financial type stuff, health stuff, or mobile phone documentation. But usually you can fit in with one of the other approved documents. So a lot of times people apply, their documentation doesn't match the address exactly, and that's okay. We will issue temporary permits to allow time to update your documents, but you will need to have your name and address on each of these documents. They will have to match the address that you're applying for a permit. Next slide, please. And you can also apply by mail. So you can download and print a copy from our website, or you can call us and we will mail one to you. Applications are typically processed within 3 to 5 business days. And the vehicle permits become active immediately because they are license plate based. You'll be notified by email or mail if you mailed your application. And then the flex permit hang tags or the visitor passes, guest passes, those will be mailed to you along with a confirmation letter. That takes about 5 business days for mail delivery. I'll hand it back over to you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. So that concludes our presentation. I was hoping that we'd have at least 30 minutes left for questions. And so, yeah, Melissa, what's in the chat?
All right, so we do have some questions here. One, there's some concern that there is a need for parking after 7, not 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. parking management.
Can you repeat that one real quick?
The first question we have is from Carrie, and they have a concern about after 7. Their issue is not 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. They're looking to enact parking restrictions after 7 p.m.
Gotcha. So yeah, she's getting at the fact that the restrictions that you can park at 7 p.m. and then you could stay till 11 or midnight at that point because they're 3-hour time limits. And the 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. is pretty common in these types of areas. I think there's some areas along Colfax where restrictions go to 11. In the Highland plan, I think they go to 9 or 10. Those comments have been received via email. So we do know that there's a concern for more turnover later into the evening, past 7 p.m. And that's something that we'll certainly consider as we review all feedback and then identify potential modifications to the plan. So that's a great thought.
Okay, and then they had a follow-up question. Will there be any permit options for small business owners?
Currently, there will not be permit options for businesses or employees. It's a residential parking permit program. A couple of years ago, we talked about whether or not we should expand the program to include businesses. And the thought there is that they would probably be preferred, that we could accommodate their needs through just leaving more unrestricted parking in place. And so if this plan was created, let's say 5 years ago, we'd likely not have the unrestricted parking on 31st Avenue, on 30th or 29th, or 34th, or 35th for that matter. It would be much more restricted. And the rationale behind that is those are the employee options, sort of these unrestricted areas. And I think in the event that we need to consider increasing the number of unrestricted block faces within our study area, we certainly can. We want to make sure that we're accommodating that employee need as well.
Wonderful. And then we had a question here from Michael Tavel. Can you describe what residents should expect in terms of enforcement of the 3-hour time limit? They have experienced problems with insufficient staff available to enforce these parking issues on weekends and evenings.
Yeah, great question, Michael. And I know that right-of-way enforcement, this is a separate department, but we work closely with them. I do know that they've been staffing up significantly. I think they're close to being at capacity. I think during the middle of the pandemic, I think maybe the capacity, it was pretty low. I don't want to speculate on what it was, but I know that they have staffed up quite a bit. And I do know that when the city implements one of these plans, especially paid parking and the time limits and all the time and effort that goes into not only creating the plan, but the sign fabrication and the install and the data collection and all the money spent on the planning and implementation of this, we want to make sure that's working well. So there's a commitment from the city that consistent enforcement will come with the implementation of one of these curbside access plans.
Wonderful. Okay. And then we did address this earlier, but David just wants to again clarify, would employees of the neighborhood also be eligible for the residential permit parking program?
They would not at this time.
Okay. And then, more concerns about business owners who own the property, wanting to have permits available. I know you said you've considered that. When will you relook at that in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. It continues to come up, and it's come up. So we're working in Rhino, and anybody that's familiar with the Rhino neighborhood knows that it's similar to this portion of, it's similar to Lohi in the sense that there's not a lot of restrictions currently. We're also proposing to implement paid parking there, and then the employee concern has come up quite a bit. A lot of business owners have the perspective like the paid parking and the time limits that's beneficial to my customers, but the employees likely won't be happy with that. So it's something that we'll continue to discuss. We don't have plans to expand eligibility to business or employees at this time, though.
Okay. And then I think this may be for Juan, but what is the cost of a permit?
There currently is not a cost. Scott, I do believe we're planning to have a fee in 2024.
Yeah, that's correct. So next Friday,
yet.
we have a residential parking permit rules and regulations public hearing at 11. It's going to run from 11 to 12:30. And that rules and regulations is basically our residential parking permit policy. And as Juan mentioned, we are looking to introduce a permit fee. Currently, they are free. They will be free through 2023. And then in 2024, we will be implementing fees. And I don't have the fee schedule in front of me, but I think the price of a residential parking permit for a single permit will be $20. And then if you wanted the flex permit, which is replacing the guest permit for those that are familiar with the program, the flex permit would be a physical hang tag that can be transferred between vehicles. Those would be $25. The residential parking permit, the $20 permit, that's associated with your license plate. So there's no physical hang tag there. One of the big changes from a policy perspective that we made with this new rules and regulations is the guest permit can't currently be used by a nanny or a service provider. It can't be used by an employee. In the future, the flex permit can. And so it's more flexible. It can be used by a nanny. It can be used by a service provider or a landscaper, what have you. So that's we're excited about that change. And that permit will be $25 annually. So if you had a couple of RPPs, if you had a couple of residential parking permits and a single flex permit, that would cost you $65 annually for those 3 permits. And that won't happen until 2024.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary Ann. She lives on the 3600 block of Pecos and didn't receive notification. Can you elaborate on who received notification of this plan?
So in theory, everybody within the study area on this graphic that you see here should have received a letter towards the end of March, 1st of April. We do get some return mail. I can certainly check to see if your address is in that stack. And I'd be happy to mail you or email you the letter that that was sent with this graphic that you see here. But in theory, everybody should have received one, and then this information is on our website as well.
Wonderful. We have a question from Reese. Their block was not included in the 3-hour limit, and they would like it to be. Do they have an option to request their block be added to the 3-hour zone, or what kind of recourse do they have?
Yeah, great question. That was one of the most challenging things with drafting this plan, is knowing when to stop. The parking occupancy, you can certainly see that occupancy is most consistent to 35th Avenue, but even north of there are blocks that are 75% or more occupied. There are a lot of orange blocks. Usually a block needs to be, 75% or more occupied before we'd recommend parking strategies. But we do know that once we implement the plan, 35th Avenue South, that we will impact parking patterns, right? We're probably going to increase occupancy in areas north of 35th Avenue. And so one of the recommendations that I didn't highlight that's very important is that post-implementation, so once this plan has been implemented, we're going to go out, we're going to collect 5 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m. data again, parking occupancy data, to see how our plan has impacted those parking patterns. And we're going to collect that data primarily for areas between 35th and 38th. We would then identify recommendations to implement between 35th Avenue and 38th Avenue. So essentially, it's not included it's likely not to be included in the initial plan, but a second phase is going to be determining how the recommendations implemented south of 35th Avenue have impacted the areas between 35th and 38th. We would then identify recommendations for that area.
Thank you.
And if you haven't already, please submit that comment to parking.operations@denvergov.org. We've certainly captured it here as well, but just want to encourage people to email us at parking.operations@denvergov.org with any other comments, questions, suggestions.
Okay, we have a question about parking in developments, new developments not providing adequate enough parking. Is there any concern from DOTI or any push to ensure that developers provide enough parking in their plans going forward?
Yeah, so that's community planning and development that sets those thresholds and sets the required amount of off-street parking that needs to be associated with those developments. And our plan really focuses on managing the on-street parking supply within the right-of-way. Although we do try to manage the impact that those developments have on the on-street supply, we're not proposing to make any changes to off-street parking requirements through this planning effort.
Thank you. We have another question from Gabby. She's a resident of 34th and Navajo, and they do not have off-street parking, and 5 adults reside in their home. They aren't able to procure enough passes for all of the adults, and they're concerned that the surrounding streets will fill up because there are so many apartments on their street. What options do they have for their very busy household?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one advantage of being located at 35th and Navajo is you do have the unrestricted parking on 34th Avenue. And so that not only is the intention that, employees or those desiring longer term parking options park on 34th Avenue or in the unrestricted areas in general, but that busy households can use that parking as well. So it provides them with a little more flexibility to park that 5th vehicle.
And Scott, that flex permit can also be used for an additional vehicle.
Oh yeah, thank you for mentioning one.
Okay, and then another question from Marianne. She's wondering when the post-implementation data will be collected for the second phase.
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have mentioned earlier when discussing the timeline for this, that right now we are tentatively slated to install the first phase of this likely in, let's call it November or December of this year. So the 4th quarter of 2023, we would then likely collect that data, within a month of plan implementation. Like, we want things to settle. People will become more aware of the fact that restrictions exist in the area. And then we'll come in, we'll collect that data and work quickly. So we are committed to making sure that we collect that data and then identify recommendations. We don't want to just implement the first phase of this and then, all right, thanks a lot. We'll see you in another 10 years. We don't want to do that. So we're committed because we know that this plan is going to impact those areas, and we will work quickly to collect the data, and we will work quickly to identify additional recommendations, and we're committed to that.
Wonderful. We have another repeat question. We've kind of addressed this before, but from Seth, that's concerned about parking for his employees. He has 12 spaces for 25 employees. Just to clarify again, would he be eligible for parking passes?
Employees would not be eligible at this time.
Thank you. And then a question from Matthew. There's concerns about rental properties in the neighborhood. He believes that they seem to turn over more frequently and have a higher need of guest parking. Is there any differences between owners and renters in this plan?
There is not technically, but I'm glad you asked that question. That's a good one. So what we find is in areas that turn over quite a bit, tenants that aren't going to live here for very long, they might only be here for 6 to 9 months. They're likely not going to update their driver's license. They're likely not going to update their vehicle registration. And so that's another advantage of the unrestricted parking pockets on the avenues, is that they provide some parking options for those people that don't plan on being in the neighborhood for very long and don't want to obtain a permit.
Thank you. And then another question from Matthew. What provisions are being made in regards to street sweeping and the impacts of having to move your vehicle for that in this plan?
This plan does not propose any changes to the current street sweeping schedule.
Okay, and then they'll be able to easily access other streets or other areas when they need to move their vehicle from in front of their house or the street sweeping section?
Yeah, I mean, street sweeping is always, it's always challenging to find parking sometimes, especially in areas that are in high demand. But yeah, no changes to the proposed street sweeping restrictions are being implemented through this.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question here. We have a family that has a garage that they can park only one car, but they have 2 cars. So one of their cars is always on the street. And they have a family member that comes daily for childcare purposes. So those would utilize the 2 passes. How would they handle their mother? How would they handle things such as birthday parties, child birthday parties, family birthday parties, get-togethers, and the like for their guests?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if I understand correctly, they have an off-street, they have a garage that they can park one of their vehicles in, and they need a total of 3 because they have the childcare provider need. So that would be great for the flex permit. Okay. So whoever's coming over to provide childcare could use the flex permit, their other household vehicle. They could get a residential parking permit for that and park it on street, and the other one in the garage. But the question about birthday parties or just, dinner parties or what have you, right? We know that people want to have a quality of life. They want to have friends and family over. And so I think that's also one of the reasons behind the 3-hour parking is because we want to make sure that we're not making it impossible for people to have guests. We've implemented some plans in areas that were pretty restrictive, and it sounded like a great idea, and the residents loved it. And they fought for those really tight restrictions. And then 6 months later, they send me an email and they say, Scott, no one wants to come to my son's birthday party because no one can find a place to park, and it's 2-hour parking on the street. And we were hoping to have people over for longer than that, or it's 1-hour parking. It's really impacting their quality of life. And so we've realized that, 3-hour parking time limits generally work better. / if they want to stay for longer than that, they can park in the unrestricted areas, and then the time limits are not effective on Sundays. And so that's another benefit. And as proposed currently, at least, the restrictions would effectively end, around 7 p.m. with the thought that you could park at 7 p.m. and then you could stay until 10, 11, what have you.
Thank you. We have a question on the parking permits for people in single-family homes with garages and without garages. Is there a difference? And will multi-unit developments be given parking passes?
Good question. So multi-unit developments less than 50 addresses or units per development will be eligible. Single-family homes that have access to off-street parking, so single-family homes that have a garage or a driveway or a parking pad off the alley will be able to obtain 2 permits. If you do not have any off-street parking access, you'd be eligible for 3.
Wonderful. And then another question here, they just are looking, and I think this is more of a statement. There is more concern about needing enforcement. The lack of enforcement on weekends and evenings is a great concern. And there's concern that people are blocking fire hydrants and bus stops and are utilizing no parking areas. So there is just a general statement that more parking enforcement will be needed. It sounds like we've had some issues with people getting into this meeting here. There is a desire, at least one that has been posted, of having a second meeting since many people have struggled to get in. Unfortunately, the DOTI website or the DOTI webpage linked to the wrong meeting. So
yeah, someone emailed me about that, and I'm not sure what happened there.
I know. So there is a general interest in potentially hosting a second meeting if people aren't able to get their questions answered.
Yeah, I think if people have an opportunity to watch this recording, maybe their question's already answered, but certainly let us know and email parking.operations@denvergov.org for all comments, questions, suggestions, and then we can certainly consider additional outreach opportunities.
Great. And then I believe you clarified this, but again, will these residential permits be hang tags tied to the license plate or both?
It'll be a combination of the two depending on the permit type. So if it's a flex parking permit, it will be a physical hang tag that can be transferred between vehicles. If it is a residential parking permit or a vehicle specific parking permit, that's the new term that we'll be using moving forward after our rules and regulations are approved next Friday. But anyways, the traditional RPP will be associated with a vehicle's license plate.
Thank you. We also have another statement here. We have someone that lives at 34th and Kivas that is very much interested in the 3-hour parking, including 34th. Evidently, they are concerned that many people use 34th Avenue for parking to attend events downtown, to go to ball games, go to Union Station, go to the airport, etc. And they leave their car there for long periods of time, sometimes in excess of 3 days. Is there any interest in or any ability to, again, request 34th Avenue as a time-limited 3-hour?
Yeah, we've received that same thought via email about 34th, and I think about portions of 31st, 30th, and 29th Avenues as well. And I think that's where this really gets tricky, right? If it's too restrictive, then it makes it difficult for people to have guests over. It makes it difficult to accommodate those longer term parking needs, those employee parking needs and employee. So yeah, and so it's difficult to find the right balance. And those are usually, that's the trickiest part of this process, is trying to find the right balance between the business perspective and then the resident perspective as well. So some residents want a very restrictive environment, some don't. And so this is our attempt at trying to provide that balance and provide those different parking options and the unrestricted and the 3 hours. So if you live on 34th and you can't park on 34th because it's full, the area permit will allow you to park on one of the streets. And so that's really one of the advantages of the area permit, is it just increases the number of blocks where your permit is valid.
Thank you. We have another person looking to clarify how employees are supposed to park in this area. What suggestions do you have for businesses and their employees that need parking in this area?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's related to my last answer too. And that really is the intention of the unrestricted parking. We call them unrestricted pockets, and perhaps we don't have enough. And that's something that we have heard. We've heard that we don't have enough, and we've heard that we have too many. Again, it just depends on your perspective. This is like some residents don't want any unrestricted parking anywhere in this blue permit area. Some want more. Some residents want more and some employees want more. And so we're trying to find that right balance. And I do anticipate that there could be some changes to this draft based on feedback received specifically around the proportion of unrestricted parking in the area.
Thank you. And then I have a question from Mary Ann that's curious. Is the area shown in light blue here the only area that's is the permit area for residents? So the light blue area, is that the permitted area for residents?
That is correct. So I'll likely update that too. So it's not clear here, but we do anticipate that the area permit would include Tejon between 35th and 38th, and it would include Navajo between 35th and 38th. Even though those blocks, those 6 blocks aren't included in this blue shaded area, the revised draft will make that more clear that those blocks are included in the area permit as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Eileen. She wants to know, are residential permits being allowed everywhere on this map, including the unrestricted? So in theory, an unrestricted area, every house will get 2 to 3 permits depending on their off-street parking access?
Yeah, good. That's a great question. So correct. So any resident that's in the blue area, even if they're located on 34th Avenue, they would be eligible to apply for a permit. So even though if you live on 35th between, let's say, Osage and Navajo, you would be eligible to apply for a permit to park in one of the time limited areas, even though you don't have restrictions on your block specifically.
Okay, and I think that relates to Reese's question with his houses or their houses on a street that doesn't have restricted 3-hour parking. They're on 31st between Why Not and Vallejo. Will they get a residential permit?
They would, yep. Yeah, so even if they're located on an unrestricted block, as long as they're within this blue shaded area, as long as they're within the Highland area permit boundary, they would be eligible for a permit, even if they have even if the parking on their block is unrestricted.
Thank you. And then we have another statement from Eileen in the chat. There is some more concern about the impacts on small businesses in the neighborhood from this, and I'm assuming for their employees. Parking and possibly some of their patrons as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then can you talk a little bit about the car share spaces? Are they exempted from this, or car share usage?
Juan, do you know the answer to that on car share? So if it's like a Toro vehicle, for example, they'd still be subjected to the time limits, right? And they would not be eligible for a permit. Do you know?
So Turo, that's the business model. That's like you can rent your own car, right? Yeah. That one we don't issue. First of all, we don't issue permits to those kinds of vehicles as far as residential permits go. So yeah, they would be subject to the same restrictions as other folks that do not have a permit. I don't know if I answered the question.
What about more traditional car share? Less people renting their vehicles and more, I can't think of it, like the car to go replacement.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Zipcar and all that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so they have the same, if they're parked in those residential streets with the restrictions, they have the same restriction. They don't get a special courtesy. Am I answering the question correctly? What was the original question?
Are they exempt from the rules, whether it's 3-hour parking? Will they be able to have a permit or anything? Where should people be?
Yeah, no, they're not exempt. No, they can't go into the residential zones and just leave a vehicle there.
Okay, and then will they be exempt from the 3-hour time limit?
They will not.
No, okay.
And there are 2, in case people are curious, it's hard to see on this graphic, there are 2 car share spaces currently on Tejon between 30th and 31st, and those are designated spaces. These are these little burgundy colors that you see on the north and south end of that block. But those are the only designated car share spaces within our study area.
Okay, thank you. And is there, are there some Uber, Lyft and delivery designation zones that you can discuss?
Yeah, that's a good question. That was discussed quite a bit with our stakeholder working group. And at the time, I think the thought was that the number of loading zones, which are these yellow and orange colors, most of them are orange because most of them are loading only all times. The thought was that most of the existing loading zones can accommodate current demand. I do think things have changed quite a bit. I mean, we know that Uber and Lyft is significant in this area in the evening, and then there's a lot of daytime demand from Amazon, FedEx, UPS, Cisco, et cetera. And so I do think based on some feedback we've received recently that we will probably be reevaluating to some extent our loading zone strategy sort of in the core here in the paid parking area.
Thank you. Another, I think we've covered this possibly more than once, but I just want to clarify, any business owners that own the property, is there any kind of exemption for them or permit options for them?
If they own the property,
If they own the property that is a business.
oh, no, they would not be eligible for a permit. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. And then let's see here. How long will it take to implement this? I know you said you were looking to start in November, December. What is the implementation timeline for that?
Sure, and that's a good segue into our next steps slide. So yeah, what we'll be focusing on now is reviewing all feedback received and then identifying changes to our plan. And the final draft will look different from this, I'm certain. They always do. So we'll be refining the plan. We'll be conducting some additional outreach between now and call it, through the summer for the most part. Then once we finalize the plan, we have to prepare like an implementation plan, which we refer to as work orders or design work. That gets real specific, exactly where on the block should these signs be installed, what type of sign needs to be installed there. We will then be doing sign fabrication and install. And so the original question was, when do you expect implementation? So there's a lot of things that need to occur between now and then, but we're confident we can get that done, implementation done by the end of the year. And then our fifth step here is following implementation. So this would likely be Q1 of 2024. That's when we would collect the data and identify additional recommendations for the area between 35th and 38th Avenues.
Thank you. We have a last question here from Gabby. Are loading zones with Saturday, Sunday, and holidays excluded going to be 3-hour parking or unrestricted during those times?
Yeah, technically they would be unrestricted parking if those loading zones are not effective on the weekends. Most of the loading zones are loading only all times, but if the loading zone, let's say, is effective, let's say there's a loading zone in the core here in the proposed paid parking area that's effective Monday through Friday, for example. I don't know if we have any of those, but if we do, that would be an unrestricted free space through the weekend.
Thank you. All right. I think we are getting to the end of our questions. I encourage anyone else that has any questions to post those to the chat here. Especially if you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to parking.operations@denvergov.org. We will post that here I'll post it in the chat so that everyone has that. Please do follow up on that with questions and concerns. Thank you very much for putting that on the screen there. A little large. But I appreciate everyone's time. I appreciate you coming, Scott and Juan. That was really generous of you to spend your time with us and answer some of these questions. I think we have reached the end of this. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Scott or Juan?
I was just going to thank everybody for attending, for the wonderful questions. And as Melissa mentioned, please contact us at parking.operations@denvergov.org if you have any other suggestions or questions, or if you want to schedule time to chat with me more about the plan, I'd be happy to. So we'll continue to be conducting outreach here for the next, call it couple months between now and when we finalize the plan. So just encourage people to provide input. And thanks again for your time and for attending.
Thank you so much for coming and answering our questions and concerns here.
Yep. Thanks for having us.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say thanks for having us. Thanks for hosting.
Thank you. Well, I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and we will get this posted on our YouTube channel shortly.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.